Hello YouTube, Ashburn Armor here. Going to do the Ruger SR9c today. So, I clean up my area of tad. Shout out to my friend who let me borrow this one, and I guess mainly his wife, who's actually the one who owns it. So anyway, this is takedown of this is fairly straightforward. You do have to have the safety off. Also, you should lock it back first and then push the ejector down. So the ejector is actually on a big ramp. If it's down and you put a magazine in, that also pushes it back into position. But down is the takedown position. That'll hold the sear away from the striker for us. And then we can do the rest, which consists of pushing out this pin, which, if you've got, you know what, it's easier to do this with it locked back. Yeah. If you start that pin with it in the locked back position, and then be careful with this piece that covers up all the other pins, or some of the other pins. You don't want to bend it though. It is just a piece of sheet metal attached to that big old pin. So we'll just set that aside, and then at that point, again, make sure that ejector is pushed down, and the slide will come right off. If you didn't push that down, the sear is still up. When you push it down, it lowers the sear so that it can't interact with the striker anymore. And that, from a design perspective, if you compare it to the Glock, when you get to this step of the Glock, you have to, before you can disassemble it, you have to pull the trigger. And if you're doing it right, it's not an unsafe thing to do, but the idea is that if you don't have any step in takedown of a firearm which involves pulling the trigger, you're technically a little bit safer. You can do the same thing with this one. When you take it down, if you leave that up, it'll hang up there and you pull the trigger and it will get past that point. But this is a way to basically get around having to pull the trigger to do the takedown. So we're going to set the frame aside, finish our regular field strip, double coil recoil spring assembly, so we don't need to take that apart. Nothing particularly interesting about the barrel, but the slide itself does have a couple neat, interesting features. So the striker itself is not particularly different from other strikers in the universe. There's a spring pushing it forward at all times, and then there's things preventing it from coming forward. So the sear normally, holds it back until you pull the trigger, at which point then it drops forward. The two different safeties that we can see here are the traditional Glock style firing pin safety up here, which blocks the firing pin right at the front of it. But then there's this one back here. This is actually the magazine safety. This does not physically interact with any other part of the regular firearm, but when you push a magazine in, the back of the magazine comes all the way up and pushes that out. Both those safeties operate in the same style. If you don't have these buttons pushed, then they are blocking the firing pin the striker from coming forward. So if I pull the striker back, it first stops here. If the magazine safety is pushed, it can actually move just a little bit further forward. So when I pull it back, you'll see it pop up. So that's the first firing pin intercept. Now it's just sitting on this safety. So if this safety is pushed, now the striker comes all the way forward, and you can see the firing pin protruding. And then as the magazine cycles, both of these end up releasing, so that both of them are going to re-engage as soon as the gun cycles. So as it comes backwards off the magazine, first this one pops up, but it won't have actually caught anything yet. And this one's going to stay down as well until the striker catches this again. And once the striker catches once the sear catches the striker, first the firing pin safety should pop up, and then the magazine safety. I did it a little bit too fast, so do it a little bit slower, and we should see firing pin pop, and then, well, kind of too close for me to demonstrate it, but technically this one pops ever so slightly before this one. Anyway, to take down the guts on the inside, what they've done is given you a takedown hole here. There's a button that you're pushing in here. It's just a detent on a spring. You don't stick anything down in the firing pin hole. You just push a punch into this hole and then lift up, and that will come off. Now that pin and spring is fairly well retained in there. It's just a spring with a large coil at the far end. There's no real reason to pull it out. It's kind of a pain in the butt to get it back in if you do. So I'd say don't worry about that one. At this point, just push down on the magazine safety and you'll be able to get the whole firing pin assembly out, at which point the magazine safety and its spring come out as well. Again, all of these are designed to be fairly tight fitting, which is kind of nice, so they come out when they keep their springs with them. We'll take this apart in a second. To get the other two out, the firing pin safety is retained by the extractor. So when we knock the extractor out, whoops, it's just a roll pin that sits in there. And once I pull my punch out, now it's just my thumb. Now my thumb is not only holding the extractor against its spring, but the firing pin safety as well. So when I pop that out, I'm going to put my finger over it just to catch that so it doesn't launch into the atmosphere. Again, it retains its spring a little bit for you, so you don't have to worry about that. The big spring goes with the extractor. It sits on its little nubbin back there. So it actually, if you look in the frame, it's not a 90-degree angle that sits at. It's off by a few degrees, so that's not a big deal. It's just when you put it back together, you want to remember to make sure that the nipple there engages. And it's a pretty big honkin' extractor, which is great. You just have to remember the other thing is, because it's over large on the top and bottom, you can't push it in straight from the side. You have to let that part sit in and then bring it back over the top. While we have it apart, loaded chamber indicator, that one's not a whole lot of rocket science. Just get the right size roll pin punch. Oops, again, I'm hitting my lights, so I'm going to slide this over for just a sec. And this one is just a roll pin that's sitting through the top of the frame like that. Again, put a finger over it when you pull that out. This isn't a particularly strong spring, but it is a spring. And actually, this one stays in there pretty well because its bottom is over large. This one actually does have one wide coil at the bottom. So if you pull it out, it's a little hard to get out because of that. And if you pay attention, I'm not sure if you're going to be able to see this on camera or not, but the last coil there on this bottom end is slightly larger than all the others, and so that just lets you know it's the bottom. So when you go to push it back in, you line it up with the hole as best you can, and then come in with something else to make sure that it actually gets tucked into its hole properly, and eventually you'll get it correct. It is a little fiddly to get it in there, but you definitely want to make sure that you do get it all the way into its hole, and when it's in there, it don't come out on its own, so it stays nice for you. So the only other thing to take apart here, really, all these can come out if you want to pull them out. This one also has a larger coil end, so to get that back in or out, rotate it in the direction that will compress the coils, and it'll slide in and out a little easier. And so the last piece is the firing pin assembly itself, which consists of 2 pieces of plastic, this little sleeve and a plastic rod, and then it's got the metal spring and then this metal housing. The plastic rod that goes all the way through is also got a hole in the end, and that spring actually bottoms out on a ledge right here. It doesn't go all the way down to the level where the roll pin is, so this hollowed out firing pin really ends here from the spring's perspective, and then it's still got an opening for the plastic piece to come further through, but the spring can't, so the spring isn't pushing on anything other than metal on this side. Let's get the, oops, that's too small. This roll pin is a little bit of a pain in the butt to get started, just because it's a tiny one, and getting the correct size punch. Sometimes I will cheat and push it off to one side to get it going using the hole in my hockey puck. And once we get it going, then it stands up for us. So now we've taken the roll pin out. The punch is retaining that plastic rod, so once I pull the punch out, the plastic rod and spring come out, and if you wanted to, it could be completely assembled. So the plastic rod has a larger end that keeps it from falling all the way through the plastic sleeve. That was the hole I was talking about that the pin is actually going through, and the spring itself, you might be able to see in there or not. If you peek down in there, what you'll see is a little rim that the spring sits on that is before the level, so we don't see the spring cross that hole because it doesn't. To get this back together, if you've got a roll pin punch with the starter set, which instead of just having the nipple actually has a little hole in it that goes around the whole thing, those are real handy for times like this. Otherwise, getting this to line up for you is kind of a pain in the butt. I think what I did last time was cheat just a little bit and start it with the help of a pair of pliers. So once that's just barely started, then we can come in here, and again you want to pay attention to where the actual hole is, so that you line it up correctly. And whoops, easiest way to do that is to take note of where it is before you put it all in the gun, so the hole I can see through those coils. And once I push it in there, you basically you know you're in, because you'll get daylight through to the other side. So once that's lined up, flip it over, tap the pin in a little further, and again you want to make sure that you're definitely going to catch that pin. I keep spinning it around on myself. There we go. Alright, so now it's far enough in that it's caught, and I make sure it's not really bound on that plastic piece. You don't want to hit it hard enough to bind that up. Switch to the roll pin punch, and you really want to make sure that this is just past flush. In other words, the roll pin, these are little beveled or chamfered holes, and so the roll pin, if it's sticking out and you can catch it on your fingernail, that's bad. That's gonna jam itself up. You want to make sure that that pin is ever so slightly recessed in there. And I think I can get one more little tap out of it. Yes, well past the, into the chamfer on both sides. So reassembly is just the same thing in reverse here. Too Too many tools on the table today. You want to drop the, well, I guess we put the loaded chamber indicator in first last time. So take this nice long roll pin. And what I like to do with these, so that I don't have to hold all the parts at the same time against spring tension, is I like to start my roll pins just a little bit. That way I know that they're lined up and going in the right direction before I actually have to hold them down with something. Now, this is another one where you want to line it up. It should go all the way to the back, and then you just press it all the way in. And we can tap this down a bit and then switch to the roll pin punch again. And this one's a little tricky because you kind of got to hold it with your thumb at the same time as you're sinking that roll pin in to get it to engage. Once it's engaged a little bit, make sure you're not binding it and it actually is rotating, and then you no longer need your thumb to hold it in. The pin itself is in the right place. And I drove it just a little bit past flush, so we'll try to make it sexy and just keep it flush. Whoops. On both sides. So that's one. The next one I like to do, oops, this is a piece from a different gun. The firing pin safety should go in next. And actually, before we even go there, I'm going to once again start the other roll pin that I need and get it moving in, so that once we actually have to push against spring tension, the roll pin itself will be most of the way in. So I'm actually going to drive that in till I see it become flush with the underside here. So I actually drove it just a little bit past flush. So if I tried to put this in now, it would probably, no, actually it's going to clear it. That's even better. Sometimes if you've driven it too far, you'll create a problem and you have to drive it back out a little bit. So we're going to put that in, again remembering that this is taller than this slot, so we have to put that part on the inside, rotate it down, make sure that we actually catch the spring. And now we've got to do the trickier part, which is holding that piece in at the same time as we have to drive in our roll pin. So if you want to, and you've got a little soft jawed clamp, you could always clamp hold that while you drive it the rest of the way in. Depends on how big and strong your thumbs are. And also, just like the other one, just drive that down in flush. You don't want to drive it down so far that it could possibly, run into the rails. So there's just no need to. So, oh my goodness, did you see that? I forgot to put, at some point, I forgot to put the firing pin safety in. I'm not a smart man, Jenny, but I would make a good husband. All right, let's try it again. Drive that guy back out. And this time, I won't be quite so silly and put that firing pin safety in. Push the firing pin safety all the way in, and then close the ramp. Excuse me, the extractor around it. And then at that point, once again, just lining it all up. Now this time I started it from the bottom. It doesn't really matter. It's got enough passage, and they've actually carved out a little piece of the slide there for just that reason. And you just want to tap that roll pin until it's all the way in the slide into the metal, not sticking up above the hole in the top or below the one in the bottom. And your firing pin safety in place this time. All right. The magazine safety, the spring side, is well, if you're looking at the gun from the top, it's the left. If you're upside down, it's basically the long end is at the opposite, is on the other side of the gun from the firing pin safety is, I guess, one way to think of it. And you're going to want to push that in while you push the firing pin in. And what I like to do to make it easier to get the back on is the more this all comes forward, the easier that is. So I'm going to actually deactivate both of those to make it so I won't have to push this plastic in as much. Because what I have to do now is just a little bit tricky, because you have to push this button in at the same time as you also push this in to get the back plate back on. Now the back plate is designed with this recessed area so that it doesn't hit this, but this really does still need to be flush with the back of the gun. So the biggest thing I have that's got a flat bottom right now is my little X-Acto knife. I'm going to put it right up in the corner of the of the slide, and when I do that, I will push in both that retainer and the back of the firing pin mechanism, and then, whoops, oh, I missed. So just do that again. I'm real close, but not quite getting there. So let me try this one more time. There we go. And you'll hear that snap is the button, the retaining button coming into place, and you won't be able to move that up or down by hand at all. And then when you pull the firing pin back, your safety snap into position, and that's the upper. That's the slide. The double recoil spring, make sure that when you're putting it in, you actually get it all the way in there. If you catch it there on the edge of the slide and you try and compress it, it's not going to go in. So make sure it seats all the way in there. And once it's all the way in there, then you can compress it that last little bit you need to get it into the groove on the barrel itself. All right, set him aside and come to the frame. So for the frame, you've got 4 pins that you're going to need to take out. This one, this one, this one, and this one. This one is special, so we'll get there in a minute. All 3 of these are retained. This one, there's a small spring in there that's also the spring on the retaining spring that goes into this groove on the takedown pin. And there's also a groove in each of these pins, which it's important in that the grooves are in 2 different places, and so you want to make sure that you don't get these pins mixed up, or they won't stay in place as well as they're supposed to, and you don't want them to drift. Whoops. So this is the bottom pin, and I was hitting the top one, but I was bottomed out on my hockey puck like a genius. So the top one and the bottom one are discernible because of where the grooves are. So in the top one, the groove is closer to the edge, and in the bottom one, it's closer to the middle. And this little guy here, it also has a retaining groove, but it's just retained into a rubber O-ring. But again, it's offset to the left, and we'll see that when we pull it out. Now this pin, if you look really carefully, you'll notice it's not round. It has one side that's filed flat, and that means it has a very specific orientation. And if you tried to push on it from the other side, it wouldn't go anywhere. And what's retaining it is actually that takedown assist lever that moves the sear up and down for takedown. But if it's in the up position, well, it can't move. And if it's in the down position, it can't move. It has a middle position. And basically the easiest way to find it is to just put gentle pressure on the pin as you're bringing it back. And as you just barely bring it back a little bit, it'll suddenly slide out on you. And when you pull this pin the rest of the way out, you'll see that it has multiple different grooves that lock pieces in. This has a flat on each side here and here. Then there's the head of it, which is larger on the left than the right, and the flat end at the very back, and then another groove there. All of that is just to lock everything in place. With those all out, the entire assembly can come out. So the locking block will lift up. There is this little spring on the side. That was the retaining spring that we were talking about. And there's nothing holding it in, but it has a little groove it sits in. But the only thing, holding it in there right now is a little bit of oil. So don't lose that. And then in the back, it lifts pretty much straight up and out. And you bring all of it out together, and it comes out as a big solid assembly. And what I was going to show you about the retaining pins is the top pin. When it's centered in the gun, you'll notice that that retaining groove, it's right aligned with where that spring is that we just took off. It's on the outside, but the bottom pin is that groove is much further in because it doesn't actually get retained by the same spring. It's retained by the back of the slide lock spring. So that is on the inside of the left side of the locking block. So that's how you know it's the bottom one, is that spring is further towards the inside. When you're putting them back in, I think it helps to put them in from the opposite side. So that's the spring I was talking about. It's on the inside. So the retaining spring for the top pin is on the outside. For the bottom pin, it's on the inside. And then, like I said, the short one, it does have a retaining groove, but it's just this rubber O-ring. It doesn't have a metal retainer that goes in there, so the O-ring will still sink into the groove a little bit, but it's not as solid a thunk as you do it when you have a metal one there. This pin is holding in the slide lock and the trigger. And the only one that's under tension, though, is the slide lock. So as we push this pin out, once we get past the slide lock, things will start flopping around a little bit. And that pin comes right out. And then you can see what's going on with that spring. So if you look carefully at the locking block, there's a groove in it down here. That's where that spring for the slide lock actually sits. So if we can see that groove as I bring the slide lock up, it sits right in that groove. Hopefully that's fairly visible. So the groove at the bottom and the slide lock spring sits there, and when it's all the way lined up with the hole, that ever so slightly intrudes onto this hole, giving us another mechanism for pin retention. These are both, there's no real reason to remove these. This is not different from anybody else's trigger safety. Basically, it's connected to the rest of the trigger bar by the top pin, and then it's got a little spring that pushes that leg back. So this safety is just a trigger block safety. When it's in its normal up position, the trigger will bump into the bottom or into the underside of the frame and prevent you from pulling the trigger. When the meaty part of your finger hits the middle leg first, that just brings it up, which means it can clear the frame to go. So the frame is normally sitting here, and if you don't have that pulled and something just bumps the trigger back, it can't actually go back where it hits the frame. I don't like to take that apart because it's metal through plastic and the roll pins will wear out, and there's no real reason to, because it's not particularly novel. I mean, if for some reason you needed to replace that spring, I guess you could do it. The rest of this is kind of interesting. A lot of it's borrowed from the Glock design, but it's got its own set of interesting features as well. So can't see a lot of them because of the safety mechanism. So we'll talk about how the safety works first. If I bring the trigger bar forward, what you'll see is, whoops, I didn't mean to actually take it out yet. What you'll see is a set of grooves right there. That's the safety. The safety, when the trigger bar is forward, the safety can be pulled up, and it basically is going to hold the trigger bar from being able to go back. So this safety is also a trigger blocking safety. It's preventing the trigger from moving the rest of the gun back and altering the location of the sear. When the safety's down, the whole trigger bar can come back. There's two different springs acting on the trigger. One is pulling it rearward, and this funky fancy one is lifting it upwards. That's kind of important for thinking about how this mechanism works. This basically pulls the trigger bar down against that spring, and then that lets it come back up. Anyway, it's easier to see this stuff when we take the safety off. This is when we really want to hang on to the safety when you do this. The safety normally can go from that position to up, but to remove it, we're going to rotate it down, and there is a spring-loaded detent right here, literally right there. So as we start to rotate this bad boy down, it goes pop, and you better catch it or it will launch itself across the room. So once we've just got it past the detent, we can remove it. It hangs onto its spring pretty well. It's got a short coil at the end, and you want to keep track of it because there's another one that looks just like it. Now I didn't pull the safety all the way off because on the right side, it's holding the trigger bar and the disconnector / connector all in place. So once I pull this further down, all that's going to start to flop around cattywampus. But there's nothing stopping us. It's just this little arm of the safety holds those pieces in place. And so once it's past them, those pieces kind of launch themselves. So don't worry about those for a minute. Just kind of hang on to them. The safety now flopping around. Pull it straight to the back and pull evenly on it. Don't squeeze these in. You want to get something that's going to let you pull it straight back and pop it out of the plastic housing there. There's not any particular position. That is just a regular round pin, and it just snaps in and out of there. So that's the safety. And what you'll see here is important for remembering how this goes back on and off. If it's up here, I'm just going to remove this guy temporarily. If you try and put it in like you do a Glock, you're going to have a really bad day. You can't wedge it in there like that. You really have to tilt it because this little leg rides in this opening space in that takedown feature. So if it's vertical, you can get it in there and then rotate it back. If you start with it horizontal, you can get it in there, but you got to pull the spring really far out, twist it around, and make a mess. Whereas here, I don't have any spring tension I'm working against. It just sits in there, and then you can rotate it into position underneath the connector. So let that tilt forward, and then you can lift it out. This spring, it just comes, oops, you can just rotate it right off that spring. Just enough room at the bottom. And now our trigger bar is completely free. So a lot of this is similar to the Glock. This also acts as a drop safety as well, and that it can't, when it's in that forward position, when it's cocked, it's going to be caught in here, so it can't really go down. It really can't go up or down until it moves back far enough, and then it can drop off. The connector is just sitting in there again like a Glock. Be careful not to bend it. We will get to a position where we can actually push it out from the other side eventually, but in this case, if it's not too grimy, it just lifts out gently. Again, you don't want to bend that. The other mechanism in here is this piece itself, and what's going on, it does snap very solidly in and out of place. At the base are two little detents on this big flat sheet of metal, and there is a spring-loaded detent pushing against them in this hole. So if I drive this pin out and just pull the sheet metal out, that detent will launch across the room and cause me all manner of regret. So when I do push this pin out, I'm going to keep a finger over that hole. And it's not so much when I push that pin out as it is when I actually rotate the piece out. I want to make sure that I'm covering that hole, because when I bring this out of the gun, now that detent pops and is free to launch. If it doesn't launch and it's in there, you can just kind of go in from the inside and just wiggle it a little bit and nurse it out, so to speak. And usually it comes right out. Well, in this case, it's not. There you go. I just wanted to be tapped. So that was sitting in this big hole and pushing against these two little indentations in the plate, so that it snapped down and snapped back up as the plate rotated around. So that gives it that positive retention, staying in one place. Also notably, the takedown pin, the reason we had to be in the middle is because that's the only place, whoops, that's the wrong pin. Helps to demonstrate that with the correct pin. Those two grooves on either side of that hole are not, they're too narrow for the pin to move. So when the pin is in this position, this has locked the pin in, and that's when it snapped forward. When you snap it back, it locks in again. When you put it in that middle position, then and only then can the pin move freely. That way, in the two normal positions in the gun, up for extraction, down for disassembly, in neither of those positions, or in either of those, it still retains the pin. When you want to get the pin out, then you deliberately hold it in the halfway position, and you can get the pin out. So that's what's going on with that. The only other piece in here is the spring, and there's a little tiny roll pin, and you can knock that out from either side. I'm not going to bother just because it's a tiny pin and it's through plastic, and if I were replacing the spring, I would, but I'm not. They left you a hole so you can come in from either side with a roll pin punch and get it. The only important thing is make sure that it's flush on this side so it doesn't interfere with the connector when we put that back in. So that's everything but the magazine release, and I didn't take the magazine release out earlier just because I've had bad experiences. They tend to be under a lot of pressure. Basically, if I push this left or right, you see that the magazine release pushes in. If you look, there's a coiled spring behind the top of it. Looks like it actually goes into a pretty good recess there. I guess I'll give it a try. If I manually hold that down, then this becomes very loose and flops around, and so obviously that spring is also the centering mechanism for it, and it's pretty close to the pin, so I may regret this, I may not. Let's give it a try and whoops, that's not the right punch. Let's find a reasonable punch and give this a try. As I said, I didn't do this one last time. It's possible that there's another retaining pin in there that I don't know about. So I drove that partially out. I'm going to now hang on to it with my finger. And yeah, that's a lot of spring tension. It's going to require a good bit of luck to get that lined back up. So, but we will be able to see how it works. So this is the spring wants to push this part out, which means the magazine catches on the top of it, but that's also pushing the bottom back, and that's got these little indents, which if I, let's see, oops, make sure I'm holding the safety right side up. There is an up and a down. It only fits in the hole one way. So those align with those grooves in the bottom. So if it's off to one side, it's going to push it. The spring is pushing it down, which will return the safety to the center. So when you push it in, that's, you know, using those ramps to push it up. These, you know, little ramped areas, that's what actually pushes the bottom out and the top in, and then the same mechanism recenters it for you. If this were installed upside down in this area, it would just flop around and not actually do anything. So, and basically it's just curved on the back there, so that whole thing works. Now, tricky bit, as I said, is getting it back in, because I have to now compress that big honkin' spring, and there's not an actual hole in the frame that went into, so it really is just a matter of lucky lining up. And I just dropped it right down. So let's just, whoops, how many times can I drop it? I'm guessing 2 or 3 more at least. Alright, so that's roughly in place. I'm going to come in and try keep it aligned and compressed with my thumb all at the same time, and see if I'm well aligned with that hole. Yes. So now I'm lined up pretty well with a smaller punch, and I'm going to leverage that to keep it more or less in place as I begin to tap it back through. And now I've gotten it far enough that I've caught it again, and switch to a regular punch. And just center that in the hole and make sure that it still works afterwards. Good to go. Alright, set the frame aside again while we reassemble all the rest of our little bits. I'm going to go ahead and put this guy back together first. In order for me to do this, I'm going to have to use a punch to hold that detent down. While I get the piece slid back in, and then the pin will go right back through, and that's just a little bit of pressure there. You don't actually have to drive that in. As long as it's flush, it'll work. It just can't be sticking out. A little recessed is fine. And so then we should feel that positive snap if the detent is in there correctly. The connector just slides back in. Again, make sure it's all the way in at the bottom, but don't ever hold it by the top bit. This spring, it does have a fairly well-defined channel that it lies in. So the tail at the bottom, when you stick it in the hole, you'll see that tail come out to be able to brace itself on that. It isn't flat on the side. It does come up. That actually gets tensioned when you put it into the frame. It compresses that, and there's a little semicircular cutout where it sits on the side. So you want to keep all that stuff lined up when you put the trigger bar back on. And again, for the trigger bar, I'm going to come in from underneath and hook that. And remember that we want this little leg of the spring on the inside of that because it's what lifts it up. We put the trigger in from this vertical so we get it under the shelf in the takedown, and then the whole thing can rotate and basically sit just like that. And so this is a good time to check your alignment of your other parts. If this piece has moved, make sure you get it back in place. We'll check that a couple more times as we go. The safety is going to snap on again next, and you want to make sure you pay attention to which is the left and the right. When it goes in like this little vertical shelf is actually going to hold these pieces in towards the center, and this side with the hole and the bump, that's where the detent operates, and that bump rides in this groove here. That arc is for where that bump in the safety sits. Oops. That spring does not want to stay put for me today. There we go. So once you've established which way is which, then remember that you're flipping it around backwards to give you some leverage. And again, try not to push on the back wings of it. You really want to make sure that you're getting a good solid even push. So if you can come in and just push on the bar to get it in there, that's great. Your next step is to rotate, to squeeze these left or right side parts in and get that flat paddle past them so that it's holding at least the trigger bar in place for sure. But you don't want to go further than that because now you have to have room for the detent to get in there. This big hole towards the back is where the detent goes, and it's spring. And once again, I'm going to make sure that I moved it just a little bit past the connector so I'm not fighting the connector at the same time. And then carefully and hanging on to it so you don't lose the detent if you miss and launch it. Just going to push the detent in with a punch, trying to keep my hand over it in case it launches, and slide that up into place. And it won't let you actually put the safety on unless the trigger is forward, because remember, it's going to grab in there. And so now the safety is on, and so it's holding the trigger bar forward. I snap the safety off, and the trigger bar is free to flop around, except I flipped it so far off that I got it on the wrong side of the connector. That was a mess. Anyway, you want to check everything. The connector is the furthest to the inside, then the trigger bar, then the retaining plate of the safety, and some extra grease. Okay, so now let's reattach this guy to the front, and the solid pin is the one that goes through. And again, remember that this little leg, when we stick this in there, it's going to sit in that little groove towards what is actually the left side of the firearm. It's upside down right here. So I'm holding that pin with my finger. I'm sliding this guy in at enough of an angle that I can catch it. I'm going to leave it without... Oh, I'm sorry. There is one other trick to this that you have to know. This little bump on the top means that when you put this in, it's always going to be under tension. So yes, you can come up here to make sure that the spring gets into the right position from down here, but then you do have to rotate it into the up position before you push the pin in, because that bumpy bit is going to keep it from rotating any further down than that. So it actually bottoms out on the locking block rather than bottoming out on the frame itself, which is kind of a nice design feature, I won't lie. So now that all these are back together, we can slide it back into the frame. The only piece we got to keep it real, there's two springs that we now have to keep an eye on and make sure that they're lined up correctly. This guy here, to make sure he's lined up with the little holes that he's going to get compressed into. Also, it's very easy when sliding it in for this guy to pop out. You want to make sure that doesn't happen and that you see it get compressed as you go in. And then the other spring is this one, which is going to flop all over the place until the side of the frame is far enough up to hold it in place. So I'm going to actually sink the locking block section in first, just so I can get that one in place. Whoops. Sorry. So once I get him just there, now he's all locked in place. Now I'll be able to manipulate the back. I won't. I lied. I got to do this in the other order. Sorry. This... where's my little red pointer? This chunk of plastic right here, this little raised rhombus, goes into this groove in the frame, and that's really your only thing that you can use to line it up. And the other important part, though, is that if you miss that groove, you're definitely going to have this spring on the wrong side of the world. So when you're lining it up, make sure that as you slide in, you don't start here and try and come back. That's going to pull that spring all cattywampus. You've got to have this pretty much lined up all the way as you go in, so that actually, yeah, see, I just made the mistake and got it on the wrong side. So before I make a disaster, I'm going to come back in, try and hold that in place a little bit better. Might be easier to probably do it in that position. I'm also going to start the trigger in a little bit at the same time. So now I've got kind of these parts both a little bit started at the same time. Ooh, bumping into the camera. For some reason, I just can't get enough light in there today to see what the heck I'm doing. Days, I think this particular spring is the bane of my existence on this firearm. mess. All right, so let's try that again. Let's get all our parts in place, lined up where they're supposed to be. I think I'm gonna try this with the safety up. Maybe that'll make it easier. I don't know. I don't remember it being this difficult last time I pulled this off. So again, get the trigger started just a little bit. And then as this guy goes in, oh dear. Alright, that was the trick. So what I was doing wrong here is that you do have to basically set the back of it in first so that the safety isn't fighting you, and then you basically rotate the rest of the stuff in. But again, as you're rotating it, you need to keep it all the way to the back of the firearm, the block here, so that that spring, as you rotate it, doesn't get kicked out. So that combination of steps is the tricky part. So you want this spring, push it in as far as you can, and then when you're going to put it in, make sure that the safety, the back end goes in first basically, and then as you rotate this down, you should I keep getting that little spring on the outside. I don't want to bend it because that would cause everybody to have just a really bad day. So I'm going to check it one more time, make sure I haven't done anything really crazy orientation wise. Nope, it's where it's supposed to be. Maybe it'll be easier if I do it from the other side. If I bring my thumb up from the inside and hold, or bring a finger up and hold that in, that's the ticket. Alright, so if you're having problems lining it up and not mangling the small spring like I was, here's your tip of the day, is come in with your finger on the inside so that you can hold it to the back as you line it up. Oops. Helps to have your trigger in far enough, and then as long as you're using your finger to push the whole plastic block to the back as you're sinking it down, you won't squish that spring. And I can see that the spring did lay where it's supposed to lay. So before, I'm not going to worry about this. I'm going to leave that block up there. We'll stretch it into position later. What I do want to do is get this, whoops, while I'm holding the locking block in. Good gravy. Oh, I can't push against this at the same time as I'm pushing against the other thing. Alright, so go ahead and stretch the locking block forward so it comes in. Now you're not, the front and the back aren't pulling against each other anymore. And actually, I'll go ahead and sink in this small pin. Again, the grooves are always towards the left. This will make sure the locking block doesn't pop out or move around on me. And what I'm trying to get to is a point where I can put the retaining pin in back here. And we know that it has a flat side that goes towards the back. Actually, if you look, it lines up. There's only one way it can go in there. I've got a piece of fuzz in mine, so I'll quickly defer you. And so holding that flat side towards the back as I go in, I'm going to run into this piece, but I know that about halfway up is the area that it can go all the way through. And again, just gently wiggling it as I go. And once it's all the way in, we know that this piece will now properly retain it. So again, the important things are to make sure that this little coil, this little single wire spring, that's a terrible description, single coil spring, is not intruding into the magazine well and bent over. It's compressed against the side of the frame properly. That's crucial there. And you know what I missed? Oh my goodness. Some days can't win for losing. After all that, I forgot to keep this spring in place. So I lift the locking block back out just enough to set him in, and then slide him back into the frame. And now my little pin can go back in, and everybody will be happy. So the two pins to retain the rest of it, I guess technically the right side is got a greater bevel, so if you push them in from the right, they'll push past the spring a little easier. The two pins, the one where the groove is closer to the center, so in my case the one on the left is the bottom pin. It will snap into place, and same with the top pin. Once it's started, it moves into place. Just tap it the rest of the way, and it will stop when it engages that spring, or at least mostly stop. There it goes. Click, click. This one's not clicking. On the bottom one, there it goes. I heard it click, and I can see that the spring for the slide lock is what's retaining it. Okay, so that's all the parts back together. This other pin is just a replaceable back strap, nothing new there. So I'm going to flip the takedown lever towards the inside, at which point I can slide the slide right back on, hopefully. And I'm going to bring it back to the locked position, and then slide the main pin back through. it's a little tough to get started over the retainer. Be careful pushing this one in. I got lucky and sank it straight. If you're off kilter though, you want to be careful not to push it all the way in really hard, because if it's twisted, you'll bend these little pieces up, and then it won't ever sit quite right again. So make sure it's lined up when you push it in. You'll feel it snap into that position. So as I'm pushing with my thumb here, it definitely retains it a bit until I push past that. And actually sometimes you need a punch to help that initial one along. So you definitely feel it snap into the retainer, is all I'm saying. At that point, if you put a magazine in, that would lift this up as well. I'm going to just lift it up manually to go through function checks. So pull the trigger, rack it, reset, trigger again, rack it, safety goes on. When the trigger's forward, can't pull the trigger because it's trigger blocking safety. Safety down, I can pull the trigger. So that is the complete SR9c from Ruger. Hope you had fun. Stay safe out there.